Hello, everybody. I'm so honored to be able to be here with you all to share what I've learned so far about trauma and post-traumatic growth through my research and clinical training. I think the image is not popping up. If you can just click next. Oh, there it is. Yes, and so I'm very excited to share what I've been working on during this time at UCSB. Next slide. Okay. So I want to start this presentation by sharing with you a quote by the 13th century Islamic and Persian scholar and poet Rumi. He wrote, "The wound is the place where the light enters you." And that is essentially the psychological process that I'm going to be talking about today. I also want to highlight with that quote that the topic of suffering and how people grow from difficulties has been relevant throughout history. We see it in philosophy, we see it in religion, we see it in literature, we see it in art. What is reasonably new is the systematic study of this phenomenon, post-traumatic growth. Next slide. The images that you see here on the screen are kintsugi Japanese art. This is the art of fixing cracked pottery. So rather than hiding the cracks, the technique involves actually rejoining those broken pieces with ceramic, gold, silver, platinum. There's this element of really owning its broken history or like it transforming it into something more beautiful. And that is essentially what post-traumatic growth is about and what I'm going to be talking about with the research. Next slide. And so post-traumatic growth is defined as the positive psychological change that is experienced as a result of the struggle with highly challenging life crises or traumatic events. The work of researchers Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun has led to the distinction of 5 particular areas where people tend to report growth post-trauma. First is stronger relationships with others. A lot of people talk about feeling a sense of connection, particularly as a result of sharing about the trauma and being vulnerable about what's happened. Secondly, seeing new possibilities that weren't there before the event. So the trauma really gives a sense of new pathways, for example, choosing to go back to school or wanting to pursue another career. So that tends to occur in the aftermath of traumatic events. Third, experiencing greater appreciation of life. And that can mean by seeing, for example, life as something more fragile or precious and having that awareness with regards to what life is about. Next, observing personal strengths. A lot of people who experience trauma and survivors report or say things like, "I lived through that, so that means I can face anything in the aftermath." And next, a deepening of spirituality. That can mean either becoming more spiritual, choosing to become more involved in a specific religion, or it can mean also the change of a belief system in the aftermath of traumatic events. And so as a result of personal experiences, I became very interested in post-traumatic growth. And I began to do research and understand this construct. I learned, for example, that when people take time to reflect or how much they reflect on in the aftermath of a traumatic event, how much they reflect on their experience, that of others and the world, what we call core beliefs, that can influence whether post-traumatic growth occurs or not. Additionally, I learned that depending on the level of distress that a person has, this can also influence the trajectory of post-traumatic growth and whether a person reports it or not. And so with that information, I began to see a gap in the literature with regards to what people do in the immediate aftermath of trauma and how that places a role in post-traumatic growth. I found very little literature in that area and I wanted to learn more. And so I began to think about research questions. Next slide. And so I set out to research the Isla Vista mass murder tragedy that impacted the UCSB campus community. This event took place in 2014, and greatly impacted UCSB. In the aftermath of this mass murder, students attended a variety of different activities to grieve and remember. For example, they attended candlelight vigils, memorial paddle outs, class discussions of the events, meditation, fundraisers, community forums, rallies, and drop-in counseling services. And that's what you see here on the screen. So I wanted to understand how this variety of post-tragedy events, both that were informal and formally organized, could influence post-traumatic growth for these students. Next slide. I knew the types of events that students had attended, and I grouped them into a number of different categories. For example, one was mental health type of events, and these were, for example, students that attended counseling services. Another one was informational support. A lot of students reached out to faculty and had discussions in class at UCSB. Others attended grieving and remembrance types of activities. So those were about candlelight vigils, memorial paddle outs. The next was coping activities. Students attended meditation, yoga, potlucks to cope in the aftermath of the event. And lastly, taking action. That category encompassed fundraisers and rallies and community forums and ways of addressing gun violence in the aftermath of the Isla Vista mass murder tragedy. Next slide. And so one of the very interesting findings that came out of this research was that participants who engaged in taking action, particularly fundraisers, rallies, community forums, reported greater post-traumatic growth. Taking action, unlike the other activities, was that one that provided opportunities for students to really engage in meaning making and to experience a sense of agency, which influenced likely post-traumatic growth. So what does this mean? Taking action can serve as an opportunity, and post-tragedy activities that involve taking action can do something with the purpose of generating change, which may subsequently influence post-traumatic growth. Additionally, the results draw attention to the need to continue to examine first what people do in the aftermath of tragedies and traumatic experiences, such as taking action, and how that may influence adjustment. Next slide. So based on these research findings, I want to share some important takeaways and things that I've learned through my experience at UCSB. First, as illustrated here by the metamorphosis of a caterpillar to a butterfly, post-traumatic growth isn't something that can be rushed. It often takes a long time to come to fruition. Some may experience it and some others may not, and that's completely okay. One doesn't necessarily need to experience a trauma or an existential crisis in order to learn from an experience. Also, just because individuals experience growth does not mean that they may not be suffering. Both growth and distress can coexist. So when thinking about trauma recovery, I propose two things that we can keep in mind, and especially during the time of COVID, the COVID-19 pandemic and the social injustices that are going on. First, social support. Oftentimes, in the aftermath of trauma or a crisis, there's an outpouring of support that takes place. People feel very connected to help a person out. But as time goes on, that social support tends to deteriorate. People who have experienced loss are still struggling. So it's really important to keep that in check and continue to check in and provide support for the long haul. Secondly, going back to my research, taking action, keeping in mind that community response and recovery activities are really crucial and can create supportive spaces for interested survivors to contribute to meaningful change, which may subsequently lead to post-traumatic growth. So you may be wondering, where do we go from here? All of us are going through a pandemic and we're reflecting on both our individual and collective growth. I'm currently looking at the psychological impact that the pandemic is having on Latinx young adults and working to understand adjustment and growth for this population. My hope is that this research will inform on growth and adjustment and will provide information with regards to the pandemic context. And maybe I'll get to come back and share those results with you all. Thank you.